So next we're going to hear from Cheryl Grant, who is part of the group that Allison was just referencing. And Cheryl's going to walk us through the evolution of credentials. How did we get here? Where did this come from? And then we're going to pivot after Cheryl to talk about the future of emerging credentials and where we go from here. So Cheryl, take it away.
Okay, can you see my, probably not yet. Can you see my screen now?
I will stop sharing, and I think that will make that happen.
All right,
There you go.
There we go. Okay, I love, through the couple of introductions that we've had, hearing so much about the conference energy, because I feel like that is probably the best way to tee this conversation up. I'll say probably 10 years ago or so, I went to a conference some of you may be familiar with. It used to be the Macarthur Foundation Digital Media and Learning Conference. And it was roughly 6 months after the launch with my team. We launched the Badges for Lifelong Learning competition. It was an initiative that was intended to tee up all of this work and to build this field intentionally. And we were partnered with Mozilla. We worked with the Macarthur Foundation, and I was based at Haystack, which was at Duke University. And so we had teed up this conversation around open badges. We were running a competition to give money away to 30 different programs. So these would be the first badging for lifelong learning programs. And the DML had this conference, and my team and I went to go see a session, and it was full, and it was standing room only. So we didn't get into the session, and we stood outside the doors, turned away, as you were saying earlier, Stephanie, and people came to talk to us about the badging conversation. It was sort of the first time that we had really been open and public, and there was no track on the DML conference schedule to talk about badges. So this impromptu, spontaneous discussion happened around badges. It started off with a couple people. It grew into a big circle. We got chairs. We were sitting around in a circle, and it became standing room only. And it was, I think, roughly 100, maybe 150 people. And it was truly one of the most exciting, energizing, intellectually curious, compelling, challenging conversations I've ever had academically, intellectually in my life. And as you probably know, because I've seen this happen over and over and over and over again in the last 12 years, this is what happens when you talk about these credentials. It brings in so many different viewpoints, so many different insights, so many different specialties, so many different kinds of expertise, so many different kinds of problems. I always refer to open badges as a big tent. Because it brought in all these adjacent conversations that were happening and brought them into one room. And so the conference energy that has really, for me, galvanized me to stay interested in this space. I hope I can capture a little bit of this in the talk that we're having today. I don't know if any of you have done this, but 30 minutes before I did this presentation, I reordered all my slides. So this could get very interesting. I don't have many slides. One of the reasons I reorganized them is I thought I want to find the right elevation for people to frame all of these conversations. It was a huge task, and it really did literally take me 10 years to sort of settle on this. That when we're talking about emerging credentials, we are not just talking about skills and assessment, higher ed, K-12. We're not talking just about this very, in some ways, myopic in terms of the bigger macro forces that are macro trends that are kind of influencing this work. So I want to make sure that if there's one thing you take away, if my internet goes out and this is the only thing that you take away from this, it's really this slide. This work by Rachel Batsman summarizes in such a succinct and, I will say, clean way. I was studying trust and reputation in online spaces before I studied badges. And I've read so many academic papers about trust in online spaces. And I love this diagram because to me, this is summarizing what the evolution of credentials is really about. It is about the evolution of trust. So the first on the left, the local, we used to negotiate trust one-to-one. You could walk into a bank, you could have a conversation about things weren't so great with my crops last year, but they're going to be better next year. And so I have paid you back in the past. It was a negotiation that was based on a local reputation. It might be the person that you knew or somebody that knew the person that you knew, but it was fairly local. And then as things got more complicated, we started to negotiate trust through institutions. And of course, this meant that there were processes and procedures, there were protocols, there were regulations, there were different ways that we negotiated this. And if you think about banks in the institutional sense, you have FICO scores, you have your lending history, you have your credit history, and it's not necessarily local, and you may not actually know the person who's lending you money. Now we're in this phase that Rachel Botsman refers to as distributed trust. And I think that this framing of the conversation about distributed trust helps us understand not just where we came from, but also where we're going to go. The distributed trust, the best way to convey it that I have found is to, and Rachel does this in her book. She's a journalist. She's not an academic, but she's got a book and some TED Talks if you ever want to look into her work. But I find it applies really nicely to credentials. And she talks about how we were always taught, or at least I was taught, you don't get in a car with a stranger. And yet we do through distributed trust. So we are negotiating trust through online platforms, through technology in a way that we haven't before. And we do it by staying in Airbnbs when we go and we stay in somebody's house that we don't know, or we have them stay in our house that we don't know. And we are offloading a lot of the trust to these platforms in a way that is very webified. So I bring this up in particular because people try, and this is absolutely not natural instinct, and I completely understand where it's coming from, but we try to define these things with terms that are familiar, even though the thing that is happening is a little bit weird, if not a lot weird, with the way that we're negotiating trust. So I think in particular for higher ed, and maybe to some extent with K-12, if we think about higher ed as primarily an institutional trust position in this conversation, you can see that institutional trust is opaque, it's closed, it's centralized, it's licensed, it's top down. These are not necessarily bad things. It's just a different part of the trust conversation. And higher ed has been remarkable at holding out and not necessarily adapting to some of these distributed trust technologies that are coming around until digital credentials became a conversation, webifying them in particular, adding the badging technology to them, has sort of put higher ed in this really interesting, almost a conundrum about, we want to maintain what is the institutional trust approach with this distributed trust technology so that we can remain relevant. And the reason I bring this up is because when we first had these conversations about badges, when I think back to the conferences or that breakout session, the exciting discussions that we had, they were all over the place in terms of, this is the best thing, this is so exciting. We had conversations about skepticism. There was a lot of concern around motivation, that this was going to break up higher ed, the monopoly that higher ed had on the degree, and it was sort of pitting this binary type of conversation. And so what I recognize looking back, and I think it is still happening to some extent, and higher ed is really driving this, has driven this narrative more so than any other sector. We talked about the badge, the top part, the sticker part, because we really didn't have the language to talk about the metadata, the structured data, the machine learning, the AI, the pieces of a credential that are truly webified. And so a lot of the discussion happened around the sort of the tip of the spear, and something happened with higher ed. And I think it has to do with this institutional trust sort of discomfort about moving over to distributed trust, that the language bifurcated, and higher ed seemed to decide, we're going to take the technology, but we're going to decouple it. And it's not necessarily going to be connected the way it was with the terminology of open badges. So I can think just off the top of my head, there's alternative credentials, digital credentials, alternative digital credentials, incremental credentials, stackable credentials, micro credentials. There's open badges, digital badges, there's skill badges. And now we're on the tip of verifiable credentials, which is a whole other thing that is building sort of on the Web3, the real distributed trust, decentralized identity kind of future that we're moving into. So I heard this in a conversation with Dr. Kelly Page, who's at Digital Promise. We were talking about digital wallets and learner employment records, which is hopefully will come up through some of the conversations later today, in particular with Phil Long. And she was saying it's not really a digital record that we're talking about. It's really a network of relationships. And that's primarily what we're talking about when we're talking about emerging credentials. It's not a tidy, fixed definition, though I know we are going to try and do that. And that's a natural instinct that I completely understand. They just aren't the conversations that I want to be having, because I feel like the technology is so fluid and so dynamic and so interesting right now that it feels like we have to get a little bit sorted out in terms of the test beds and the pilots and the research before we can actually say that this thing can be called this thing and it's different. So, for example, micro-credentials can be decoupled from technology, and I'm not sure why. I don't fully understand why you would have a micro-credential program that just goes to a transcript, because a lot of this work is really about creating these high-resolution transcripts that can be broken off into the right size chunks for learners who want to communicate that to whomever they choose to do, whether it's an employer or somebody else that's in their discourse community or somebody in their program. The technology does not need to have higher ed's approval in order to be used. So sometimes you will see people give badges for reasons that may not have any value other than to the learner or the earner on their own. So all of this evolution is being driven really by these decentralized technologies that can be a little bit uncomfortable if you are used to being the arbiter of value, which is what higher ed has had that privilege for a really long time. So I don't have a very conventional view on this. I think when it comes to defining what emerging credentials mean, to me, I think the emerging is the interesting part, the evolution is the interesting part. And what is so exciting about right now is it feels like we're in a second wave of what was happening 10 years ago, where we're trying to find language to describe some of these adjacent badging technologies to figure out how those are going to fit into this ecosystem. So for example, digital wallets, you'll start to hear a lot more about this. I think this generation that's coming up is going to take for granted that they should be able to keep their credentials in a wallet and do with them what they want. So I feel like that excitement around that value proposition is brand new in the same way that digital badges were brand new 10 years ago. I do want to kind of go back, just do a little history loop on this is a sort of a collage of some of the headlines that came out very early in 2012. And there was this real pitting of sort of this binary thing. And I think the media is very good at this, making it seem like there's a fight there. This idea that you would have a badge that was going to undermine what the universities were offering with degrees or credentials. And it never made sense to me, because it has always felt like a both and, that there is learning happening all over campus, not just in the course units or the Carnegie unit or in these 4-credit programs. It is happening all over, and badges allow there to be a high resolution of that learning. And of course, right now, what we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out, how do you communicate value? How do you sort of tidy up this curriculum string and have it make sense to somebody that you are giving a badge to as though it were currency? Obviously, we've had a big chunk of that with degrees, and now we're starting to modularize it and do it at a very small, more granular, not just with one badge or one micro-credential, but also with micro pathways or curating these career pathways so that people can see, I can do these 3 courses and this is going to take me to this. So the conversations that I hear sometimes that honestly drive me nuts is this idea that these two cannot exist together. And I think I think ASU and many of the colleges and universities that are leading the way with a lot of this work are able to hold these two things at the same time and allow them both to exist, and let learners define the value for themselves if they think that it's valuable, as well as creating these micro credentials that have really elevated all of the human practices that create a high quality, high value, very rigorous, very authentically assessed micro-credential. I think both those two things can exist with the same technology. And this is just to go back. This really happened to us in the very beginning when we were talking about badges. People did laugh about it. And I can tell you, I worked at a university where there was somebody who had the title innovation in their job title, who said to me that part of their job was to protect the institution from innovation. And I feel like badges sort of came out with a 1-2 punch with that. One, the word was not acceptable if you are trying to present yourself as a prestigious institution. And the other is that the word badge suggests games, and it suggests things that we just don't consider with serious learning. So there was this whole period that we went through where, and this Michael Olnek, who wrote this, is a scholar who is an education sociologist, and he was really trying to get to the bottom of it. What is it about in higher ed that allows us to, or makes us want to sort of push back on this idea of badges as something that is a legitimate way of expressing or communicating the value of our learning? Well, that's my 5 slides. I just got through them so much more quickly than I thought. I really wanted to try and make this conversation. I was so excited when I saw how active everybody was in the chat. I really want to use this as an opportunity for a conversation similar to the kinds that have been happening all over the country, all over the world around this work. And I know I didn't want to get too much into what is happening in terms of how credentials are evolving, but if people have questions about that, I would love to open this up to Q&A and have a conversation and invite people to both share what it is that you're thinking and also ask any questions that you might have about how some of this work has evolved.
Thank you, Cheryl. And I think if we can offer the opportunity for anyone who wants to raise their hand through Zoom, we can call on you to ask a question, but I'll start the conversation with, how do you think generally employers are feeling about the nature of credentials? Like, do HR professionals understand what they are? Do they know which ones are, there was a term in a webinar I went to last week called fluffy, or the fluffy ones versus the serious ones. And has there been any kind of a collective outreach to employers, HR professionals, to help them understand the important nature of what this is about?
So I will say that what I find fascinating with some of the research I've been doing with HR professionals is that the same restructuring and kind of running around and experimenting that is happening on higher ed side is also happening on the HR side. So you see these pockets of movement, of change management, primarily driven by skills-based hiring and the need to do this very rapid, this blistering pace of change is affecting both employment and it's affecting learning. So what you see happening over there is the same paradigm shift, the same change management, the same idea that we have locked into some ways of doing things that have to change if we are going to remain relevant and stay up. The other thing I find really interesting is that the job applicant tracking systems were pretty rudimentary 10 years ago, and they are not good. They are still not good. If you have not looked for a job in the last 5 years, you may not know how much of a robot experience it really is. So there's tremendous interest on the HR side. That one of the most interesting organizations I think right now, and you'll hear from Phil talk a little bit about this later, is T3 Innovation, which is funded in part by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. And in my recollection, it's really 2016 when they got involved and brought the juice of the employer perspective to this work. And that's where the learner employment record and a lot of this work around HR open standards and trying to figure out, how do you take the metadata that's inside these badges, the structured data, and set it up for machine learning in a way where we can start doing some of the really interesting things with credentials that we have done with many other parts of our lives, whether it's banking or communication, or all these things that are happening with machine learning and AI is of tremendous interest on both sides of the conversation, higher ed and employers.
I'm going to let John Mott ask a question, and then I will have a follow-up question to that. John, if you can unmute yourself, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. Yeah, there was a question earlier about reach out to employers, and somebody mentioned that they did a survey of employers, and there wasn't a lot of understanding or trust of badges. We've been doing a lot of interviews with both recruiters and hiring managers, and there's still quite a bit of lack of trust that a badge would communicate something to them that they could just automatically trust and bypass a step in the process. I think where we want to get is that recruiters and hiring managers look at a badge and they go, oh, okay, I can automatically move somebody forward in a process, maybe to the interview stage, but we're not quite there yet. We're missing that trust level, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I often think of micro-credentials as the tip of the spear for change. They are sort of the Trojan horse that goes in there, and your institution, how much change you can handle is going to depend on the kind of institution you're at. So two of the most interesting employers, I think, in this space for setting the tone is Walmart and IBM. Walmart is putting a lot of money into this in many, many different ways, into nonprofit initiatives, as well as having one of the biggest badging systems. I think they're the biggest employer in the world, and they have a badging system that works internally, and it's fascinating. And then IBM has got a very similar type of, it's sort of an approach that is almost just seems to me like a hustle. Inside, you finish a project, and then if you want to get on another project, you are communicating your skills. And if you don't have those skills, you go to get them, and then you go back on the market and try and find another project within IBM. I mean, that kind of internal gig economy is a model. Obviously, IT is a little bit different in that regard, but those employers that are using badges internally are norming badges within their own organizations, and those are big employers. Obviously, there's a lot of work to do, but I feel like we're 10 years into the higher ed side of figuring this out, and I think we are somewhere in the 3 to 4 year mark with the employers. So there's a little bit of a lag on the employer side. I've seen the research from SHRM. I know Sean Gallagher has done research that's really good. There's a group called the Non-Credential Research Network. And when you get into the research, the real nitty-gritty of the research, you realize it's sort of a categorization challenge, trying to figure out what exactly are we saying when we say it's a digital badge. For example, you could take a Google Professional Certificate in Data Analytics on Coursera, and you can push your credential to LinkedIn. So that's a digital badge, but that is not an open badge, and it doesn't have metadata. It's not structured data. It's useful on LinkedIn, but it's not useful anywhere else, and you don't have a choice about where you can put that. So we just don't have the volume yet to really bring some of the HR side, but all of the trends, everything is pushing that way. That has to get better for them. They have to be able to figure out how to find people based on skills. It's just not quite there yet. We're still trying to get organized on their side. They have to come up with the definitions of their job roles. And then on the higher ed side, we have to really figure out which of these pathways are going to be specifically driving into employers.
Cheryl, we have a question from Naomi, then I have a couple of questions for you.
Hello, everybody. I'm just going to follow up on John's question, and I will probably get into some of this SHRM research, Cheryl, that you were mentioning, but first, the concept of trust has multiple variables. So when we're talking about trust of the digital micro-credentials, there's the element of how do I validate that this is truly a credential, right? So that's that verifiable trust that needs to come through so someone can so that it becomes a verified credential. There's also the trust of what that credential represents. And until the systems are able to say, this is something I can click on and find that metadata and learn that metadata, it becomes really important. Trust is also as far as awareness and understanding. And so there is work going on the employer and the business side of things, the corporate side of things with regard to the digital micro-credentials and the skills-based hiring and the skills economy, just like there is on the higher ed side of things. I don't think as a community we've done that we have merged the two. So the conversations across the two have not necessarily converged where they need to inform practice on both sides. And I think that's required to build those trusting relationships.
So Naomi and Cheryl, do you think that's going to happen with partnerships or collaborations between various sectors and industries and credentialing platforms? They'll choose a preference. Okay, if you get this badge, then you're definitely at the top of our list. Will it be that type of a partnership that you think builds trust within the employer structure?
I think it sort of depends on how you carve it out, because some people, I mean, the open badge is a container and you can put anything in it. Western Governors University is putting a degree in it. I mean, that part of the badging technology is agnostic to the size. You can put an industry certification inside a badge, and somebody could conceivably find that skill in an employer, higher ed, or community college agreement. And this is happening in some of our colleges with more of the industry certification. So around OSHA training or forklift training. I mean, we're seeing a lot of really interesting things with technical colleges, with the workforce development side of community colleges, with some of the states that are really trying to populate get their databases of who's got what skills around nursing. So it's very similar as it is to higher ed. There are some organizations that are moving really nimbly and they're coming away with some really compelling stories that look promising, but it's obviously, we're not at a point where you are putting credentials into a wallet and you are saying that you're passively looking, an employer is probing and searching and finding that there's somebody who's actually out there that's got that match. That hasn't happened yet, but that value proposition is part of why many of us are doing this work.
And where do you think trade associations fall into this equation? Do you think there's going to be collaborations between trade associations and digital credential providers?
I suspect so, only because I think that trade associations are working hard to maintain membership. I think there's a lot of learning design that's happening with trade associations in order to show relevance. I feel like the other word that goes along with this work, in addition to trust, is relevance. It's pushing a lot of the winds of change for a lot of different organizations, trying to figure out, is this going to be the big play? Is this the next thing? Is this where everything is going next? And I feel like relevance is such a huge piece of the conversation in terms of the paradigm shift for everybody.
And I think a great word that was brought up in the chat was gatekeepers. So if we're looking at HR professionals as gatekeepers, what are we doing to level set with them? What students will be coming to them with once they graduate, once they're upskilled, where does that factor into the equation? So if we do think of them as gatekeepers, what can we do to level set with them regarding what credentials actually mean?
Yeah, I think to me, I look at, people often talk about currency when they're talking about micro-credentials in particular. And I think there's really two ways to define it. I think that the currency, the value of something, can be something that is on my terms as the learner. I get to decide if this is of value to me, and I get to decide what I want to do with that credential, whether I'm going to have the smarts to know that this is something I share with my employer or not. That value, I feel like, is not in the narrative as much as I would like it to be. I do understand we have a lot of work to do in terms of setting the currency externally. And I think it's going to be this very interesting, maybe sometimes uncomfortable relationship between higher ed and employers about meeting up somewhere halfway. And it's probably going to be by sector. It could be by region. Some of these bigger organizations I know that have badging systems inside are probably going to norm it a little bit, but absolutely with HR, I feel like, and I can't tell you how many times I hear people say bad things about HR. It's got to just be like the hardest part of the organization to be in. Right now, what we're trying to do at T3 is figure out what are the adoption and implementation barriers for them. It's a little bit of a black box, but we do have experts that are talking to us from Deloitte and from Accenture about what some of those nitty-gritty processes are like on the HR side, so that we can better understand. Because as people who've looked at this research know, executives have a different idea about these things than hiring managers, than HR. So we're really trying to look at where the rubber meets that those gatekeepers, the HR, and understand what it is what are the constraints that they're working with? What are the things that are not working well in the platforms they have? And where are these openings where we have a little bit of play in terms of getting this kind of data into their databases so that they can start leveraging it.
Do you think that current employers or current employees, because of the nature of algorithms and the way that they're developing, regardless if they have 20 years of experience, do they need to start acquiring badges so that when algorithms start being applied to the job search from the HR perspective, they get caught in the algorithm and are brought into the hiring process? Do you foresee that as something that needs to happen or start happening pretty quickly?
Meaning people who already have 20 years of experience, do you have to start surfacing your skills so that you can get found in these? That's a
Exactly.
great question. Oh, I hope not. I know I have heard from people at IBM who say they have like 50 patents, but they're all retroactive. And I know this was a big conversation when we first started badges for lifelong learning, is what do you do about retroactive badges? And I feel like that's a prior learning assessment conversation
And
to some
this
degree.
person is actively illustrating.
Oh, sorry, I thought someone was asking me a question. Like leaning in, it's going to be a good one.
Yeah.
So I feel like that's part of what our community has to sort of figure out. Where do we sit with prior learning assessment? In some ways, it's very similar to the military conversation. These people who come out of being in the military and they've got very advanced skills, and then they have to not just show that they've got those skills, but also communicate in a language that makes sense in a civilian workspace. So that's a big part of the conversation. The Department of Veterans Affairs was involved with us from the very beginning, and I see some of that work kind of moving forward, and I don't know exactly how well that will be a model for some of these other kind of use cases, like people who've got a 20-year career. It's hard for me to imagine that right now, honestly, because I feel like we've got so many pieces that we sort of have to get into place. But I'm sure there will come a time where people will feel like, I need to be able to do a competency assessment in order to show that this skill that's very important on this job description or this job role, that I will probably need to find a way in order to express that, if that's the socially normative way that people are hiring and not just an add-on.